Welcome to my tough text presentation. I'm gonna try and keep it kind of lighthearted and directed, but we want to talk about why we teach a tough text, and I think there's plenty of reasons. So I hope I highlight them with my choice, and I hope you guys are persuaded. If not, I'd love to talk about it. So let's get started. To start off, I want to introduce my book, and I think it may be a little confusing on why I chose it. Some people you could read this and not think of it as a tough text to read, but I kind of wanted to challenge myself a little bit and pick something that would take a little bit of digging, a little bit of research. Maybe you can see my ambiance. I brought back my light because I am doing the City of Ember. As you know, I did the book talk on it, and after hearing about the tough text presentation, made me think about, is this really a tough text? Is this kind of sci-fi type book really going to challenge readers? Is it going to challenge a teacher to teach? Is it going to bring up interesting and important topics that we might face today in this weird climate of a pandemic and an election year and all sorts of different aspects that tough text kind of address? So let's not waste any time. Let's dig right into it and start off with a little summary. Ember is about Lena and Dune, who are 12-year-old kids who live in the city underground because of nuclear fallout on the surface. We follow them get assigned their jobs because everyone is assigned their jobs for life at 12 years old, with a corrupt mayor in charge who is hiding the truth about why they're down there and why the lights are going off. When you're living underground, you need lights. So Lena and Dune embark on this journey to figure out the truth behind Ember and how they can save their city. The big question is, should we teach it in a middle grades setting or really even in high school? And that really is up to the teacher. I'm gonna vouch for it because I think it does represent a tough text in some aspects, and we're gonna go over those in a minute. But what type of difficulties are going to come with reading a text like this? So I think first we need to establish the genre, and a couple key reasons why I think this could be considered a tough text and one that should be pursued in a class. So the first one is that I would consider this more of a science fiction, dystopian type novel, and the reason behind that is because of the setting. As we know, that the setting has a lot to do with a lot of young adult novels now that we see. As far as dystopian goes, we think about the Hunger Games, we think about the Maze Runner series, Divergent series. The setting drives the plot, and so I think City of Ember does a good job of using the plot to develop the characters and allowing for the tough aspects of social dynamics and political power to show through the character struggles by the plot, which is driven by the setting. The setting is what has accounted for all of these different aspects that consider it a tough text. Reasons to highlight really quick that make this a tough text and something that you can relate to as far as our climate goes today. And I mean political and social climate, but also the environmental climate. This story really highlights the importance of taking care of your surroundings and your earth, because they're underground for a specific reason, which is a nuclear fallout and stuff that's gone up over on the surface. So, and then the last part is, of course, the political reign over the people. The mayor has plenty of power. He has plenty of money. He is completely different than the average working class person represented by Lena and Dune. And it's really important to kind of highlight those aspects and being able to relate that to today. What does that look like? And that's kind of a reason why this might be challenging to teach as a tough text and to relate to the climates going on today with the social, political, and environmental aspects. But that's kind of where I wanted to go with this, is that how are we teaching a science fiction book and being a tough text? What are the aspects and context of that book that are relatable to today? Looking at the difficulties of this text and that what the students might experience when they're reading it, we want to first talk about kind of the contingent difficulty that was highlighted in the book, in the reading, not City of Ember, but Alan's book. So the contingent it's focusing on like the vocab and the words and the meaning of the words. And one thing that I looked up was the Lexile scale, and City of Ember was rated about a 680, which is kind of this floating number. But that being said, that puts it at about a fourth grade reading level. This is kind of an aspect that I think it should be highlighted when discussing tough text. Is that yeah, we can look at that, but really it's going to take looking at your class and their experiences and their abilities and rating it off of that. This is kind of just a number. It's Scholastic's. The references from Scholastic. They're the ones who deemed it that. But when you're talking about a book that has it's science fiction first off, so it's hard to sometimes put ourselves into that environment, into that story, just because we think of science fiction as aliens and all sorts of robots and technological advances and futuristic stuff, which this book takes place in the future, but there's a lot of aspects that can be related to today, which I highlighted earlier. So just something to think about when picking a tough text and why this might affect a student. But really, it's up to the teacher in deciding, is this appropriate for students to read. So the next one would be the modal. And basically, it's just, trust the text. When you're dealing with science fiction or dystopian novels, you read it and it seems very abstract, but trust the text. Read it with an open mind was one of the strategies highlighted in the reading. Some of the potential risks that come with teaching science fiction. And I'm a very big advocate for science fiction. I've always been a fan. So Star Wars, all that's my game. So why would you want to teach science fiction novel, dystopian novel? What are some aspects that parents might have issues with? Because there are risks that come with picking really any book, because everybody's going to have their subjective ideas about it. So I think one important aspect is to make sure you maybe send a newsletter out, or you send your schedule out, explaining what you're going to be doing, especially when it comes to reading a book, because it is going to take a while, it is going to take time. So highlighting some key important aspects of it being a tough text, you want to make sure you communicate that with the parents and the risk that comes with it. So we're going to be talking about, we're going to be trying to connect it historically as well. So we'll get to that in a minute into the teaching strategies. But highlighting why you're reading it. So, well, it's to talk about, it's science fiction. It's not often read in schools. It talks about environmental struggle in a society that is broken and is underground, and something that seems abstract, and trying to connect it to today, in our world today. And then lastly is kind of the governmental restraints that come with power over people. And how does that look socioeconomically today? How does that look socially today? And do we see any similarities between that? Talking about resources as well with the environment, which would be a really good point to bring up as well. Okay, let's get into the good stuff, the teaching strategies. How would you go about teaching this? From a historical and a social studies lens, you definitely could teach it and connect it to a really crucial part in time, which we can talk about in a minute. But first, we want to talk about the scaffolding. How do we prepare our students to read something that seems very abstract? It doesn't seem like it could happen. How do we scaffold and get our students to then see how it relates to our surrounding environments today? So the first part, of course, mentioned in our textbook was the EXO scaffolding. So one of the biggest aspects of this that I could find and do a little bit of research on was, look at it as a framework. Before it even starts, before you even start reading, highlight, what you're going to get into. Set the boundaries. I've always talked about thinking inside the box, and that sounds very negative, and it sounds very against what you always hear. Think outside the box. But if you think inside the box, if you create parameters for students to think of or to think in, you're keeping them in a directed state. You're keeping them in that zone of proximal development. So setting up not necessarily parameters, but guidelines and direction to keep them on the path of what you want them to learn. And that allows for students to break out and to think independently, but keeping them inside a zone of proximal development, keeping them inside direction, keeping them in the right direction. Progress really isn't progress if it's not in the right direction. So that's a very key important part. And this can be done by setting up student norms and conversation norms, setting up respect. And I always advocate for student decided norms, student created respect guidelines. And those are usually done at the beginning of the year, so it's just important to remind them before getting into these weird conversations about environment, political drive in the story of the city of Ember, and how does that relate today. Two forms of scaffolding are endo and the meta talk. So first off, when talking about endo scaffolding students while reading City of Ember, um, we want some teacher intervention, and this could be done from students being in small groups and addressing questions that might come up, because sometimes the language in science fiction novels or dystopian novels can be kind of tricky. So it's important for students to be prepared and teacher presence to be there while they're in small groups, or book talk groups, book club type stuff, but addressing, like we talked about earlier, contingent difficulties, which remind you contingent difficulties are relating to language and vocabulary within a novel like this. So the next one is meta talks, and this is really just a type of reflection. It talks about strategies that will translate into the real world. So how can we lead this book and the conversations that come up from the themes of the book? So we have, like, again, environment, government power, greed. How can those be translated into the world we live in today, to where students can understand it and see them side by side? Activity I think would be really fun to do in class would be having students assigned roles that they don't choose, and that are very blatantly related to the book and the context of which is in. So for example, we have a couple students or one student who is the mayor or the political power in the classroom, and they get to sit at your desk. They get candy, they get A's, fake A's, but A's. And then the other students are given, you know, sweeping duty or desk cleaning duty or board cleaning duty, all that kind of stuff. So I think that would be really fun, kind of introductory activity to kind of express the social dynamic in the book, which would be really fun to do. And next, another one would be, this is the important part about connecting it to history, the Cold War, nuclear uh, problems between the Soviet Union, United States, and Cuba. So that part could be thrown in there as well, because the book is ultimately about that happening on the surface, sending people underground. So connecting how that affected people back in the 50s and 60s, and do we see any of the same aspects of how that society is run back then and in the book. So and another part would be kind of highlighting the children labor laws. So these kids were 12 and going and working in the pipes where the generator was. That's where Dune was going. U.S. Department of Labor, great resource. The FLSA, which was the law passed on it, be a cool kind of primary resource type activity. And finally, to end, I want to talk a little bit about a type of assessment you can do when doing City of Ember, reading it. And there's nothing wrong with doing the before, during, and post reading strategies and taking those as formative assessments. And then as a summative assessment, you could also take do like a project with big piece of paper, and have the students look at how do we see our world and how does Lena and Dune see theirs, and comparing the two. That'd be a cool activity as well. But before reading strategy, of course, getting a historical context of Cold War and nuclear consequences with that, and how does that relate, and how does that foreshadow what's going on there in City of Ember. During would be, you could be creating like a city map, and with scenes as we continue to go out through our story. And then finally, the post would be our summative, or our chart. So that's my presentation. I hope it went well. I hope I persuaded you. So thanks, guys.